decided to return to the house where he spent his childhood, 30 years after losing everything. Once a luxurious family mansion, now it stood in ruins, overgrown with grass and moss. But when he went down into the basement, he realized the past wasn't dead. It had been waiting for him all this time. Subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments, where are you watching this video from? The road that led to the old estate wound through fields that had long since forgotten the touch of a plow. Autumn light stretched thin across the horizon, pale and cold, as if the world itself had grown weary of color. A lone figure moved along that road, a dark-skinned man in his early 50s, shoulders stooped beneath the weight of a frayed backpack, his clothes worn but clean. His name was Daniel Brooks. 30 years ago, this stretch of land had been his family's kingdom. Now it was a wilderness of weeds and silence. The wind carried faint traces of salt from the distant marshes and the dry rattle of grass along the fence line. Daniel's boots crunched over gravel as he climbed the hill, the motion slow but steady, like a man walking toward a memory he was not certain he wanted to face. When he reached the crest, the sight of Brooks Hall stopped him. The mansion stood like a corpse of architecture, its white columns streaked black with mildew, the roof sagging inward beneath decades of neglect. Windows gaped like open wounds, and ivy had strangled the balconies where his mother used to stand, waving to guests arriving in polished carriages. Once, this had been the heart of a dynasty. Now it was a monument to ruin. The family crest, a bronze medallion set into the rusted gates, had turned green with corrosion. Through the grime, Daniel could still make out the words engraved beneath the Brooks family symbol, Veritas Vincit. Truth prevails. The irony made him pause. He unlatched the gate. The hinges protested with a shriek, startling a crow from the roof. As the bird rose into the gray air, Daniel's mind filled with echoes, laughter spilling from the terrace, piano notes drifting from the parlor, the low murmur of business discussions between his father and the city's elite. All of it had vanished. He stood for a long moment, feeling the slow rhythm of his heart and the strange quiet that followed him everywhere now. He had dreamed of this return many nights during his years on the streets, but never like this. In those dreams, the house was still alive, still radiant, his father's voice booming from the balcony. The reality was a hollow shell. He began the slow walk up the cracked stone path. Grass and wildflowers had swallowed what had once been a manicured garden. The fountain in the courtyard lay dry, filled with leaves and rainwater that reflected a distorted sky. At the base of the front steps, Daniel stopped again, resting one hand against the banister where time had eaten away the marble. He could still see himself as a boy, sliding down that railing while his mother pretended to scold him. The image passed like breath on glass, gone before he could hold it. He pushed open the massive oak door, which resisted at first and then gave way with a groan. The smell that greeted him was a mixture of dust, decay, and something else, an old scent that lived in wood and fabric long after people had gone. Inside, shafts of pale light spilled through broken windows, illuminating floating motes of dust. The great hall was both familiar and unrecognizable. The sweeping staircase still rose toward the upper floors, though part of the banister had collapsed. Portraits of ancestors hung crooked on the walls, their painted eyes dulled by grime. Daniel's gaze lingered on one in particular, his father, George Brooks, captured at the height of his power, sharp-featured, confident, hand resting on a globe as if he commanded the world itself. Daniel's throat tightened. That portrait had once filled him with pride. Now it filled him with questions. He walked deeper into the hall, his footsteps muffled by a carpet eaten through by moths. Furniture lay beneath dusty sheets, their outlines ghostly and misshapen. The house seemed to breathe around him, the soft hiss of the wind through cracks, the creak of boards settling, the faint tap of rain beginning outside. He wondered if this place remembered him. As he explored, memories came unbidden. The dining room had hosted endless dinners where polished silver and crystal gleamed beneath chandeliers. The library had been his sanctuary, filled with maps and adventure novels his mother had given him. Every corner was a fragment of another life, but the silence now was heavy, accusatory. He felt like an intruder in his own past. Near the parlor, he found a collapsed piano, its ivory keys yellowed and scattered. A faint sense of grief rose in him. Grief not just for the house but for the people who had once filled it. He could almost hear his brother's laughter echoing down the hall, the sound that had once seemed harmless before it became cruel. Outside, daylight dimmed, and the first drops of rain began to tap against the windows. Daniel set his pack down near the hearth in the great room, where the old fireplace stood black with soot. He gathered scraps of wood from fallen beams and struck a match. The flame caught, filling the space with a faint orange glow. The warmth felt almost alien after so many nights of cold pavements and shelter floors. He sat close to the fire, listening to it crackle, and pulled from his pocket the letter that had brought him back. The paper was creased from being read too many times. It was brief, formal, unsigned except for the seal of the firm that had handled his father's estate. All remaining properties of the Brooks family are hereby transferred to you, Daniel George Brooks, as sole surviving heir. Sole surviving heir. The words sat heavy in his chest. There was no one left. No father, no brother, no cousins. Time had stripped everything away until only he remained. He had not decided whether that felt like justice or punishment. When the fire began to fade, he lay down on the wooden floor, using his coat as a pillow. The rain grew heavier, and water dripped rhythmically from a crack in the ceiling. For a moment, he almost believed he could rest. But then came the sound that made him open his eyes. Footsteps, faint and deliberate, moving somewhere above him. He froze. The sound came again, slow, measured, as though someone were walking down the upstairs hall. He waited, holding his breath. The house settled with a groan, and the noise ceased. It could have been the wind, he told himself, or a raccoon, a stray animal. Yet the feeling remained, an awareness, a presence. He tried to dismiss it, but sleep did not come easily. The house whispered and sighed through the night, its old timbers murmuring in the dark. He dreamed of faces, his father's stern gaze, his mother's sad smile, his brother's cold grin, and woke before dawn, heart pounding. Morning light revealed more of the decay. The wallpaper had peeled away in strips. Water stains marked the ceilings. On the dining table lay a silver tray coated with dust so thick he could write his name in it. He did, tracing the letters slowly. D. Brooks. For a strange moment, it comforted him, as if he were proving to the house that he still existed. He spent the day wandering through the rooms, examining remnants of another era. In the study, he found ledgers, their ink faded but still legible. He turned the brittle pages, scanning accounts of shipments, investments, the steady rise and fall of fortunes. The handwriting was his father's, precise, disciplined, confident. Daniel's own memories of the man were a mixture of pride and pain. George Brooks had built an empire with hard work and iron will, but he had also built walls between himself and compassion, between his sons and understanding. By afternoon, Daniel ventured upstairs. The grand staircase creaked beneath his weight. The second floor was darker, the air heavy with dust. His old bedroom door still bore the brass nameplate his mother had installed when he was 10. The handle turned stiffly, but the door opened. The room was smaller than he remembered. The bed frame was broken, the curtains rotted away, but the faint outline of his old life remained. On the wall, faint pencil marks still measured his height through the years. He stood beside them now, realizing he had grown into the very man his father had once hoped he'd be, only without the privilege, without the comfort, stripped of everything but endurance. He sat on the windowsill, looking out across the overgrown lawn. Somewhere beyond the trees lay the town, where people still whispered his name with pity or scorn. He wondered if any of them knew he had survived. Probably not. In their eyes, Daniel Brooks had vanished long ago. The scandal had buried him deeper than any grave could. Evening fell again, and the house seemed to exhale. Daniel returned to the great room and rekindled the fire. This time he ate from a small can of beans he had brought with him, the humble meal oddly fitting amid the ruins of past luxury. As the firelight flickered over the portraits on the wall, he felt the old anger begin to stir beneath his calm, not for the years of hardship, but for the lie that had cost him everything, the accusation that had driven him into exile. He thought of his brother's face the last time he saw it, smirking as their father shouted. Malcolm's triumph had been complete, but now, after 30 years, fate had brought Daniel back, and with it a faint, stubborn hope that perhaps the truth could still be found within these walls. The night deepened. Outside, frogs croaked in the pond, and the wind sighed through the trees. Daniel sat beside the dying fire, staring into the embers until his eyes burned. He thought of the motto on the gate, "Truth prevails." His father had believed that once. Daniel wasn't sure he did, yet something inside him, some small battered spark, whispered that maybe the house had called him home for a reason. He rose, took the lantern from the mantel, and walked once more through the darkened halls. His footsteps echoed softly. At the far end of the corridor, he stopped before the portrait of his father. The painted eyes looked down at him with that same mixture of pride and judgment. "I'm here," Daniel murmured to the silence. "I came back." The house offered no reply, only the faint rustle of wind through shattered glass. Still, he felt it, the pulse of the place, the sense that something unseen had been waiting. He extinguished the lantern and stood in the darkness, letting the memories wash over him like rain. When he finally lay down again near the hearth, the weight of years pressed upon him, yet beneath it flickered the beginning of resolve. Tomorrow he would start searching. The house had buried the truth once before. Now it was his turn to unearth it. As dawn approached, the light crept through the broken windows, painting the cracked floorboards gold. Daniel Brooks, the last heir of a fallen empire, rose from his makeshift bed and faced the ruins that had once been his world. Somewhere in the bones of this dying house, he believed, a secret still breathed, and he intended to find it. The morning that followed Daniel's first night in Brooks Hall came slow and gray. The air inside the house was cold, as if the stone itself had absorbed decades of silence and sorrow. He woke to the sound of rain dripping through the cracks in the ceiling, pooling in shallow puddles on the warped wooden floor. For a long moment he lay there, staring at the high beams above, feeling the strange ache that only memory could summon. The fire had gone out during the night, leaving behind faint wisps of smoke and the smell of burnt wood. He rose stiffly, rubbing the chill from his arms, and looked around at the ruins of what had once been a symbol of power and pride. He thought of how far that power had fallen, and of the years that had carried him away from it. The memories came back like a fever. He could see the house as it had been, the gleaming floors, the smell of polished mahogany, the echo of footsteps across marble. In those days, the Brooks family was a dynasty. His father, George Brooks, had been a figure of legend in the South, a man of vision and unbending discipline, the owner of a shipping company that sent vessels across the Gulf and beyond. Newspapers had called him the Iron Gentleman, and people spoke his name with a mixture of admiration and fear. He believed in order, in legacy, and above all in the purity of the family name. Daniel, as the younger son, had grown up in the long shadow of that name. His brother, Malcolm, was older by 6 years, broad-shouldered and ambitious. Their father adored him for his confidence and cunning. But where Malcolm sought domination, Daniel sought purpose. He had studied engineering, dreaming of using the family's wealth to build schools and infrastructure for the poor communities surrounding their estates. His father tolerated those dreams with polite indifference. Malcolm mocked them outright. Yet, for a time, they had coexisted, two sons moving through the same grand halls, both certain of their place in the world. The first fracture appeared the year their mother died. She had been the heart of the family, the only one who could temper their father's stern will or draw laughter from his sons. Her death left a hollow silence that nothing could fill. George Brooks retreated into his work, drowning himself in figures and contracts. Malcolm took control of the family's public dealings, and Daniel, too young and too principled for the ruthless world of commerce, became an afterthought in his father's empire. He remembered standing in the parlor on the day of her funeral, his hands trembling as he looked at her portrait above the fireplace. Malcolm had stood beside him, whispering words that still burned in Daniel's memory. "You'll see, little brother. Without her, this house belongs to men now, and men do what they must to keep it standing." From that day forward, the warmth left Brooks Hall. The house became an office of sorts, filled with the constant shuffle of lawyers, investors, and politicians. Daniel tried to help, offering to manage the estate's workshops, but his brother dismissed him as naive. "You don't understand business," Malcolm had said. "You understand ideals, and ideals don't pay the bills." Daniel's efforts to prove his worth only deepened the rift. He proposed new ventures, transportation networks, better housing for workers, but each idea was met with derision. His father grew increasingly reliant on Malcolm's advice. The older brother learned quickly how to twist that trust into control. The final betrayal began with a whisper, a rumor that one of the company's accounts had been mishandled, funds missing, contracts altered. Daniel was summoned to his father's office, where Malcolm sat, waiting with a folder of papers. He still remembered the smell of tobacco and the weight of their father's gaze. George Brooks had looked at him not as a son, but as an accused man. "Is it true?" his father had asked. "These transfers from the reserve accounts, your signature is here." Daniel had taken the papers, heart hammering, and seen his name scrawled at the bottom of a series of documents he had never signed. "This isn't mine," he said, voice breaking. "Malcolm, you know this isn't mine." But his brother only leaned back in his chair and exhaled a slow, thoughtful sigh. "It's your handwriting, Daniel. Maybe you've forgotten. Maybe you've been handling more than you realize. We've all been under strain since Mother's death." The meeting ended with shouting, accusations, and the first cold distance in his father's eyes. Within a week, newspapers were carrying the story. Scandal in the Brooks line, embezzlement allegations against younger heir. The disgrace was swift and merciless. Reporters camped outside the gates, neighbors whispered behind lace curtains, and business partners withdrew in silence. His father demanded an explanation, but by then the evidence had been carefully planted. Bank statements, falsified signatures, and letters forged in Daniel's name sealed his fate. Malcolm stood beside their father through it all, the loyal son, the voice of reason. Daniel tried to fight back. He sought out lawyers, begged for a fair hearing, but the family's influence worked against him. The scandal had to be contained. Someone had to fall. And his father, fearing ruin, chose to sacrifice his younger son to save the name. The night of his exile returned to him with merciless clarity. It had been raining, just as it was now. He stood in the foyer, pleading with his father one last time. George Brooks turned away, his voice flat. "You will leave this house and never return. You have shamed us enough." Daniel had looked to Malcolm then, hoping for some trace of mercy, but his brother's expression was serene, almost triumphant. "It's for the best," he said. "You need to find your own path, far from here." He had walked out into the rain with nothing but the clothes on his back and the echo of the gates closing behind him. The years that followed blurred into a single, endless descent. He drifted from town to town, finding work where he could, repairing engines, loading freight, cleaning docks. When there was no work, he slept beneath bridges or in abandoned buildings. He learned to read people the way other men read books, who would share their bread, who would steal it. Pride, once the blood in his veins, was replaced by endurance. There were moments of kindness. An old mechanic in Savannah who taught him how to mend clocks. A widow in Baton Rouge who fed him for a week without asking his name. But there were cruelties too. Cops who drove him from park benches, drunks who spat at him, employers who vanished before paying him. Over time, his anger cooled into something quieter, something that no longer sought revenge but understanding. Now, as he walked through the hollow remains of his family's empire, he felt the echo of that long exile in every creak of the floorboards. The house had changed, but the wound it represented had never closed. He moved into the study where his father had once conducted business, the same room where the accusation had destroyed him. The desk still stood in its corner, though one leg was splintered. On its surface lay the ghostly imprint of papers long turned to dust. He sat in his father's chair and let his fingers trace the grooves in the wood. "You believed him," he whispered. "You believed every word." The words left his mouth like smoke, curling upward and fading. As dusk fell, Daniel rose and paced the length of the room. Through the broken window, he could see the overgrown gardens stretching into darkness. Somewhere out there, beyond the fields, the world had gone on without him. But here, time had stopped. The house seemed frozen at the exact moment of his disgrace. He wondered about his father's last years, whether guilt had ever touched him, whether the truth had ever tried to claw its way through the lies Malcolm built. It was hard to imagine the iron gentleman bending to remorse, but perhaps even stone could crack given enough time. The wind picked up, sending a low moan through the corridors. It sounded almost like a sigh. Daniel stood there listening, his reflection faint in the dusty window pane, and for the first time since his return, he spoke aloud to the empty house. "If you remember me," he said softly, "then help me find what's left of the truth." That night, as rain swept across the estate, Daniel lay once again near the hearth, But this time, sleep brought no rest. He dreamed of the trial his father had never given him, of the crowd that had gathered to watch him fall. In the dream, he stood before them holding a single candle while the walls around him burned. And above the roar of fire, he could hear Malcolm's laughter, a sound that had haunted him for 3 decades. He woke before dawn, drenched in sweat, his hands trembling. The fire had long since died, and the only light came from the pale gray of the approaching morning. For a moment, he thought he heard footsteps again upstairs, the same slow tread as before. But this time it no longer frightened him. It felt like an invitation. He rose and climbed the staircase. The boards groaned beneath his weight, but he kept going. The hallway stretched ahead, lined with portraits of the Brooks lineage. He passed them one by one. Generations of stern faces, each painted to look immortal, untouched by weakness. At the end of the corridor hung the portrait of his brother, painted the year before Daniel's exile. Malcolm's eyes, once lively, now seemed to follow him with a cold amusement. Daniel stopped before it and stared. "You took everything," he murmured, "but you couldn't kill the truth." The face on the canvas gave no reply, but as he turned away, the frame creaked faintly in the draft as though the house itself acknowledged the words. Back downstairs, Daniel sat by the cold hearth, the weight of the past pressing down like the heavy air before a storm. He realized that he had not come back merely to reclaim the property or the title. He had come for the one thing that had been stolen from him completely: his name. And somewhere within these walls, buried under years of dust and deception, that name waited to be uncovered. Outside, the rain eased, and a pale sun broke through the clouds. The light caught the fragments of glass on the floor, scattering them into small reflections. Daniel watched them glitter, thinking how strange it was that even broken things could still catch the light. The house, the name, the truth, perhaps they could too. He rose, took a deep breath, and looked once more around the vast, decaying room. The time for remembering was ending. The time for searching was about to begin. And as he stood there, surrounded by the ghosts of the past, Daniel Brooks understood that the fall he had endured all those years ago was not the end of his story. It was only the beginning of the climb back towards the truth that had waited, silent and patient, in the heart of the house that had never stopped remembering him. The rain had stopped by morning, leaving behind a sky the color of pewter and a mist that clung low to the earth like a breath that refused to disperse. The air inside the mansion was heavy with the dampness that followed storms, and the faint scent of mold lingered in every corridor. Daniel woke to silence, a silence so complete it pressed against his ears. He sat up slowly, feeling the dull ache in his limbs from another night spent on the floor, and for a few moments he did not move. The world seemed to wait, as if holding itself still to see what he would do next. The memory of his dream clung to him like smoke. His brother's laughter, the flames, the accusation. And though the details had blurred, the emotion remained sharp, raw, unyielding. He stood, stretching stiff joints, and gazed around the room that had been his refuge. The remnants of his small fire lay cold in the hearth, reduced to a gray mound of ash. Through the broken windows came a faint light, soft and colorless, illuminating the long shadows that reached across the floor. For a while, he simply listened to the house breathe. It creaked, sighed, and murmured in low tones as if speaking a language known only to itself. He felt as though he were living inside the chest of some sleeping giant, something ancient, powerful, and not entirely dead. He began his morning by walking through the great hall. The floorboards bent beneath his feet, their groans echoing faintly against the tall ceilings. In the corners, cobwebs trembled from the lightest draught, and the smell of decay deepened the farther he went. Yet, the deeper he ventured, the more he sensed a strange vitality in the air, a presence beneath the dust and ruin. The house seemed to recognize him. He wandered into what had once been the music room. The grand piano lay in ruins, its lid snapped, strings exposed like the ribs of a carcass. He brushed his hand across the keys, and a single, hollow note rang out, startlingly loud. It reverberated through the chamber, bouncing off the walls and fading into silence. That faint echo seemed to awaken something within him, a memory buried so deep it felt almost foreign. He saw his mother again, sitting at that very piano, her fingers gliding over the ivory keys as she played the same hymn she always favored when the air outside turned heavy before a storm. Her voice had been soft, warm, full of something he had since forgotten how to name. The image dissolved as quickly as it came, leaving only the ruin before him. Daniel drew back his hand and looked around the room. The wallpaper, once pale blue, had turned the color of bone. Fragments of ceiling plaster littered the ground. In the far corner, he noticed a series of water stains spreading down the wall like the veins of a leaf, and something about their pattern drew his attention. He stepped closer. The stains seemed to trace the outline of what could have been a doorway, now sealed by boards and plaster. He ran his fingers over it and felt a faint vibration, as though air moved behind the wall. "Hidden places," he murmured. The Brooks house had always been full of them. Servant passages, storage cellars, narrow stairs that twisted behind the walls. As a boy, he had found them thrilling, a secret world belonging only to him and his brother. But now, as he stared at that faint outline, the idea of something sealed and forgotten filled him not with excitement, but with unease. He left the music room and made his way toward the west wing, where the study and library were located. The heavy oak doors stood half open, and the scent of rotted paper greeted him as he entered. Dust lay so thick upon the floor that each step left behind a clear print. The shelves towered on all sides, sagging beneath the weight of books whose pages had curled from years of moisture. He moved carefully among them, brushing aside cobwebs, scanning the spines. Most of the titles were legal volumes and ledgers, the tools of his father's trade. He found an old ledger on the desk, opened it, and saw his father's handwriting, precise, methodical, unyielding. Beside every column of numbers was the neat signature, George H. Brooks. Daniel traced the ink with his fingertip. How many nights had he stood here, watching his father pore over these same pages, refusing to rest until every figure balanced perfectly. The memory struck him with a surprising force. The smell of whiskey, the ticking of the clock on the mantel, his father's low voice telling him that a man was only as good as his word. He wondered what that man would say now, faced with the ruins of his empire and the truth of his own blindness. A faint sound interrupted his thoughts, a rustle, light but distinct, coming from the hallway. He turned sharply. "Hello?" he called, his voice echoing through the empty space. No answer came. He waited, holding his breath, but the sound did not return. Perhaps it was only the house shifting again, or the wind moving through cracks in the plaster. Still, the hairs on the back of his neck stood up. He set the ledger aside and opened one of the lower drawers in the desk. Inside lay a collection of yellowed papers and a small metal box, tarnished and locked with a rusted clasp. He lifted it out, testing its weight. It was heavier than it looked. The clasp resisted at first, but gave way with a sudden snap. Inside, he found a folded letter sealed with a fragment of red wax. The seal bore the family crest, the same Veritas Vincit emblem he had seen on the gate. His breath caught as he recognized his father's handwriting across the front. For Daniel, should he ever return. For several seconds he could not bring himself to open it. The sight of his father's hand was too intimate, too alive. His heart thudded in his chest as though the man himself stood behind him, waiting. Finally, with trembling fingers, he broke the seal and unfolded the brittle paper. The letter was brief, the ink faded but legible. "My son," it began, "if this reaches you, then you have found your way back to what was once your home. I have little time left and much to confess. I was wrong to doubt you. The truth was twisted before my eyes, and I allowed it. What I know now cannot be undone. I have hidden the records that prove what was done to you. You will find them below this house, in the place we once sealed. I pray you forgive me when you read them." The letter ended without a signature. The words swam before his eyes, and for a moment he could not breathe. He folded the letter carefully and pressed it to his chest as if the paper might dissolve if he let go. A tremor passed through him, a mixture of grief, anger, and something that felt dangerously close to hope. He sank into the old leather chair behind the desk, the springs groaning under his weight. Beneath him, the floor creaked faintly, and a new thought took shape. His father had mentioned something below the house. Could it be a cellar? A crypt? He tried to recall the architecture. There had been rumors, even in his childhood, that the mansion sat atop an older structure, perhaps part of the original estate built before the Civil War. The idea that something had been deliberately sealed away was unsettling. He rose and began to search. Behind the desk, he found a section of the wall paneled in dark wood, smoother than the rest, with a slight indentation near the baseboard. Kneeling, he ran his hands along it until he felt the edge of a concealed hinge. The panel swung outward with a soft sigh, revealing a narrow alcove and a short stairway leading downward into darkness. Cold air breathed up from below, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and age. He hesitated at the top of the stairs, lantern in hand. The rational part of his mind told him that there could be nothing of value down there, that this was only a storage space long forgotten. But the other part, the one that had followed his father's voice across 30 years of silence, knew he had to descend. The stairs groaned underfoot as he went down, the lantern casting long, shivering shadows on the stone walls. The air grew colder, thicker. At the bottom, he found a small chamber lined with shelves, the remains of crates stacked in uneven piles. Papers lay scattered across the ground, their ink dissolved by moisture. It was a hidden archive, preserved and forgotten in equal measure. He moved through the room slowly, lifting fallen ledgers and folders. Many were beyond saving, their pages fused together by mold, but one caught his eye. A folder bound in leather, its clasp still intact. Inside were financial statements, letters, and contracts. The dates ranged from the final years of his father's life. As he read, a picture began to form, a web of transactions that connected Malcolm Brooks to companies Daniel had never heard of, shell firms registered in distant cities. Money had been siphoned off, redirected, laundered, and buried. His brother had not only framed him, he had stolen the family's entire fortune under their father's name. At the back of the folder lay a smaller notebook written in George Brooks's hand. The entries were erratic, the writing uneven, as though penned by a man in turmoil. "He knows what I found," one line read. "They will not let me speak. If anything happens to me, the truth lies below the floor of my study." Daniel froze. The floor of the study. He was standing on it now, though in a space beneath it. He raised the lantern higher, its light catching something metallic in the far corner. There, half buried beneath debris, was a small safe, blackened with age. The lock had been scorched, as though someone had tried to burn it open. Yet the door was still sealed. He brushed away the ash and found that the hinges were intact. On the front, etched faintly into the metal, was the Brooks crest. He stared at it for a long time, his pulse hammering. Someone had found this place before him. Someone had tried to destroy what lay inside and failed. His brother, perhaps, or those who had helped him. The realization sent a cold shiver through him. He climbed back to the surface and returned to the study, his mind racing. If the truth his father had hidden was powerful enough to kill for, then it was still dangerous. But for the first time in 30 years, Daniel felt something more potent than fear. Purpose. The ghosts of his family's past were no longer confined to memory. They were here, whispering through the walls, demanding to be heard. As the evening light dimmed once more, he stood at the window of the study, the letter clutched in his hand. Outside, the world seemed unchanged. Trees swaying in the wind, the faint shimmer of the pond beyond the garden. But inside him, everything had shifted. His father's voice, long silent, now spoke through ink and paper, through the creak of the boards and the breath of the old house. When night came, Daniel sat by the hearth again, but there was no fire this time. He stared into the dark, his thoughts heavy with revelation. Somewhere beneath his feet lay the evidence of everything that had destroyed his life, and perhaps the key to restoring it. The house, in its strange way, had begun to guide him, through noise and silence, through decay and memory. It was as if it wanted him to see, to remember, to uncover. The ghosts of the past were not specters of the dead. They were truths buried by the living. And now that he had begun to stir them, there could be no turning back. The house had awakened, and so had he. Night had fallen again over Brooks Hall, but this time the darkness seemed different. It was not merely the absence of light. It was dense, heavy, watchful. Daniel sat by the cold hearth, the letter from his father resting in his lap, and listened to the house breathing around him. Every creak and sigh of the timbers carried the echo of memory, and the words of the letter would not leave his mind. "You will find them below this house, in the place we once sealed." He had found something beneath the study already, but he knew instinctively that what he had seen was not all. The small vault, scorched and unopened, had been only a part of the secret. There was more, something deeper. His father had always been meticulous, precise. If he had written of the place we once sealed, it meant more than a cellar. It meant something built with purpose, something meant to stay hidden. The lantern on the table flickered as if stirred by an unseen breath. Daniel rose and began to pace, the weight of the old floor groaning beneath his boots. His mind replayed the words he had read in the journal he found, the line that spoke of danger, of those who would not let his father speak. He thought of Malcolm and the shadowy partners who had surrounded him, men who profited from deceit and influence. He thought of his father dying alone in this house, trapped between truth and fear. The walls themselves seemed to hold the echo of his final confession. Daniel took up the lantern and returned to the study. The smell of mold and dust hung thick in the air. He crouched beside the desk and examined the floor, pressing his palms against the boards. They were cold to the touch, smooth but not seamless. His father's note had mentioned something hidden beneath the floor of this very room. He tapped the boards gently, listening for a change in sound, a hollow resonance. The third board from the hearth answered with a faint echo. He knelt lower, ran his fingers along the groove, and felt a narrow gap, barely enough for a fingernail. His heart began to race. He took a rusted letter opener from the desk and wedged it into the gap. The wood resisted at first, then gave a sharp crack. Dust rose in a cloud as the board lifted. Beneath it lay a small recess lined with stone, and in that recess a metal latch glinted faintly in the lantern light. He brushed away the dust, revealing a square of iron set into the floor, its hinges nearly invisible. A hidden door. The latch turned stiffly, the metal protesting as he forced it open. A draft of cold air rose from below, smelling of earth and time. He lowered the lantern and the light spilled into the narrow shaft of a descending stairway carved into stone. His pulse quickened with both dread and wonder. The steps looked ancient, older than the house itself. He hesitated for only a moment before setting his foot on the first step. The deeper he went, the colder it became. Moisture glistened on the walls, and his breath formed pale clouds in the air. The passage twisted slightly, as though following the shape of the hill on which the house had been built. When he reached the bottom, the stair opened into a low chamber, circular and lined with brick. The lantern's glow flickered over rows of wooden shelves, and in the center stood a heavy table covered in dust. Papers, ledgers, and bundles of documents lay scattered across it. Time had yellowed them, but their order suggested that someone had once worked here deliberately, methodically. Daniel approached slowly, the sound of his boots muffled by the damp floor. He set the lantern on the table and began to look through the papers. The handwriting varied. Some pages in his father's sharp, precise script, others in the rounded hand of a clerk. There were letters dated decades before his birth, accounts of shipping transactions and receipts for cargo that included strange notations. Human property, passage north, special manifest. He frowned, recognizing the terms from history. These were records from before the Civil War, when his ancestors had run the shipping empire that built their fortune. But the entries were odd. Many transactions ended abruptly, some marked with a single word, safe. He turned another page and found something that made him stop. A map. It showed the estate as it once was, but beneath the drawing of the house were lines and symbols he didn't understand. Tunnels, chambers, and a series of arrows leading northward. At the bottom of the map was a note in elegant script, "For those seeking the light." The realization struck him suddenly and deeply. His family, his ancestors, had used this place as a station on the Underground Railroad. The Brooks estate, known for its wealth and prestige, had secretly sheltered fugitive slaves and helped them escape to freedom. For a long moment, Daniel stood in silence, overcome by conflicting emotions. Pride, sorrow, disbelief. All his life he had been told that the Brooks name was built on enterprise, on industry, and leadership. Never once had anyone mentioned this legacy of courage and defiance. His father must have discovered it late in life, just as Daniel was discovering it now, and perhaps that truth had inspired him to atone for his later failures. Yet the chamber held not only relics of nobility, but also signs of corruption. On the table beside the map lay more recent papers, modern documents with his brother's name, detailing offshore accounts, false contracts, and payments to politicians. He leafed through them, feeling his stomach twist. Malcolm had turned the same legacy of secrecy into an instrument of greed. The same hidden network that once saved lives had been used to conceal crime. The irony of it was almost unbearable. His father had hidden these papers here, below the house, as if to protect both the honor and the shame of their name in one place. And someone had tried to destroy it. The scorched safe in the cellar above was proof of that. He spent hours in the chamber, reading by the dim light of the lantern. The air grew thicker, colder, but he hardly noticed. Each document he uncovered painted a clearer picture of what had happened. How Malcolm, after his mother's death, had manipulated their father into transferring company assets. How he had bribed accountants and silenced witnesses. How he had orchestrated the scandal that ruined Daniel to ensure his own control. The final pages in the pile were written by George Brooks himself, his handwriting uneven, as though written in haste. Malcolm knows everything. I fear he means to end it. If I cannot stop him, the truth must live here. Daniel must be the one to find it. I was blind to the evil I raised. God forgive me. Daniel's eyes stung as he read. The words blurred. His father had known. He had realized too late what his elder son had done, and in his desperation he had hidden the truth in the very foundations of the house, trusting that someday Daniel would return. He sat there for a long time, staring at the last line. The faint drip of water echoed somewhere in the shadows. When he finally looked up, he noticed something else. An iron door set into the far wall, half hidden behind stacks of crates. He rose and went to it, pushing aside the debris. The door was heavy and rusted, but when he touched it, it gave a dull, hollow sound. There was no handle, only a circular indentation where a key might once have fit. He searched the shelves and found a small brass key inside one of the drawers, tied with string and labeled simply "Lower Room." His hands trembled as he fitted it into the slot. The lock clicked softly and the door creaked open. Beyond it lay a smaller chamber, no larger than a chapel. The walls were lined with stone, and in the center stood an old wooden table. On it rested a single object, a leather-bound book wrapped in cloth. Daniel stepped forward and unwrapped it. Inside were pages written entirely in his father's hand. But these were not ledgers or accounts. They were confessions. The first entries spoke of discovery. His father had learned of the family's forgotten history, the role the Brooks estate had once played in the struggle for freedom. But the later entries darkened, becoming fragmented, almost paranoid. They have turned the house into a vault for their crimes, one line read. Malcolm and his partners used the old passages to move what should never exist. I've tried to stop it. I am watched. I hear footsteps outside my room at night. Daniel turned the last page. The handwriting faltered there, as if written by a dying hand. If anyone finds this, know that the truth is buried deeper than money. Our name was born from redemption and ended in greed. Daniel, forgive me. He closed the book slowly, his hands shaken. The silence of the room pressed in on him until he could hear nothing but the thud of his own heartbeat. He understood now that his father had died not merely of illness, but of fear. Malcolm's corruption had become something far darker than business. The house had witnessed it all, absorbed it into its bones, and now it seemed to breathe that pain through every crack and shadow. Daniel gathered the documents, the book, and the map, packing them carefully into his satchel. As he turned to leave, a faint noise broke the stillness above him. A sound like a door closing. He froze, listening. Another sound followed, a floorboard groaning, slow, deliberate. Someone was in the house. He extinguished the lantern, plunging himself into darkness. His breath came shallow and fast. He waited, listening, but the sound did not come again. Perhaps it was the wind. Perhaps not. He climbed the stairs back to the study, moving silently, every sense alert. The house was quiet once more, but the feeling of being watched lingered. He crossed the room and looked at the portrait of his father above the mantel. The painted eyes seemed to follow him, filled with both sorrow and warning. "I know now," Daniel whispered. "I found it. I'll finish what you started." The words felt like a vow. The truth was no longer buried. It lived in his hands, in the papers that could restore his name and expose everything Malcolm had built on deceit. Yet he knew that truth was a dangerous thing, and those who had once silenced his father would not hesitate to do the same to him. He looked around the study at the flickering shadows cast by the dying firelight and realized that the house was not done with him yet. The secrets it had guarded for generations were awake now, and they would not rest until the final reckoning came. The hidden room beneath the floor had given him the past. What waited above would soon bring the future, and with it the confrontation he had spent half his life avoiding. Outside, the wind rose again, rattling the windows. Daniel stood at the center of the ruined room, his heart steady now. The house had given him its truth, and in return he would give it justice. The ghosts of Brooks Hall were stirring, and their time of silence was ending. The night that followed was long and restless. Daniel barely slept. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw the image of his father's trembling handwriting, the last plea for forgiveness scrawled across the yellowed pages of the journal he had discovered in the hidden chamber. He lay near the hearth, listening to the shifting breaths of the house, the distant settling of beams, the faint scrape of wind against cracked glass, the soft murmur of leaves brushing the walls outside. But beneath those sounds was something else, something heavier and more deliberate. Every so often, a board creaked somewhere on the upper floor, and though he told himself it was only the house adjusting to the night air, he could not shake the feeling that someone else moved within the decaying walls. When dawn finally broke, pale and cold, the house seemed to exhale. The light filtered through fractured windows, cutting across the room in long, trembling shafts. Daniel rose stiffly, his body aching from exhaustion, and stirred the embers in the fireplace until a small flame returned. He poured water from his canteen into a dented tin cup and drank, trying to clear the fog of sleeplessness from his mind. The satchel containing his father's journal and the documents from the hidden room lay beside him. He had read through them again before dawn, until the words etched themselves into his thoughts like scripture. Every line confirmed what he already knew. His father had been murdered, and Malcolm had orchestrated everything. It wasn't just about wealth or inheritance anymore. The family's reputation, the company, the estate, none of those things had ever mattered to Malcolm except as weapons. Power was his only devotion. And now, after 30 years, the empire he had built from lies was beginning to crumble. Daniel could feel it in the air, as tangible as the damp scent of dust that clung to the walls. The truth was a weight that could no longer stay buried. He spent the morning restoring order to the study, clearing away the debris left from the night before. It felt almost sacred to him now, the room where his father had worked and hidden his final confession. As he moved a stack of broken books, he found a small photograph wedged behind the desk. It showed the three of them, George, Malcolm, and himself, standing in front of the fountain that once adorned the front courtyard. His father's hand rested on his shoulder, Malcolm's expression proud and fixed. They had looked like a family then, untarnished, untouched by betrayal. The sight of it filled Daniel with a mixture of sadness and quiet fury. By afternoon, the sky had turned a bruised gray. The wind had risen, sweeping dead leaves across the veranda and sending faint whistles through the cracks of the old mansion. Daniel sat at the desk with the journal open in front of him, trying to plan what to do next. He knew he could not keep the truth hidden any longer. The documents he had found were proof, bank transfers, bribes, falsified records, enough to destroy what was left of Malcolm's legacy. But he also knew that simply revealing them would not be easy. There were men still loyal to his brother, men who would stop at nothing to protect the remnants of the Brooks name as it existed under Malcolm's rule. As the afternoon darkened toward evening, he lit the lantern and began sorting the papers into bundles, marking the most critical evidence. He would need to take them to town, perhaps to a lawyer or journalist, someone who could help him make the story public. But even as he thought it, an unease settled in his chest. He could not leave yet. There was something unfinished in the air, something he needed to face here, in the heart of the house itself. The thought had barely formed when he heard it, a sharp sound, unmistakable, cutting through the howl of the wind. It was the slam of a door. He froze, every muscle tightening. The noise came from the back of the house, near the servants' entrance. He extinguished the lantern and stood in the half-darkness, straining to listen. For several seconds there was nothing but the sigh of wind. Then came the soft crunch of footsteps on the lower hallway floor, slow, unhurried, confident. Someone was here. He moved silently to the door of the study and peered into the dim corridor. A faint glow, the beam of a flashlight, swept across the far wall. Daniel's heart began to hammer in his chest. He stepped back, gripping the edge of the desk. The light drew closer, moving with deliberate precision until it spilled into the study doorway. A shadow followed it. A tall figure in a long coat, broad-shouldered, his silhouette unmistakable even after 3 decades. "Daniel," the voice said, calm, smooth, and chillingly familiar. "You always were your father's favorite ghost." The flashlight lowered slightly, and for the first time Daniel saw his brother's face in the pale light. Malcolm's hair, once jet black, had turned silver at the temples, but the eyes were the same, sharp, calculating, predatory. He smiled, and the expression was as empty as the hollow rooms around them. Daniel didn't speak. He only straightened, his jaw tightening as Malcolm stepped fully into the study. "I knew you'd come back," Malcolm continued, glancing around the room. "The firm told me someone had claimed the deed. I almost didn't believe it. But here you are. The prodigal brother returns, drawn home by ghosts and guilt. You knew I'd come because you left no one else," Daniel said finally, his voice low. "Father's gone, mother's gone, and everything you built is starting to rot, just like this house." Malcolm laughed softly, walking toward the desk. "Still dramatic, I see. Always the poet. I used to envy that in you. Father loved your idealism, your endless compassion. He thought you'd save the world." He paused, his expression tightening. "Turns out, the world saved itself by getting rid of you." Daniel's fist clenched at his sides, but he stayed still. "You framed me. You destroyed everything I had. And for what? To sit on a throne of ashes? Or survival?" Malcolm replied simply. "Father was weak. He built his empire on nostalgia and sentiment. I built mine on reality. The truth, little brother, is that the world rewards those who take what they want." He moved closer to the desk, his eyes flicking to the satchel resting beside the papers. What's this? Daniel stepped forward, blocking his reach. You stay away from it. Malcolm tilted his head, amusement glinting in his eyes. Ah, so that's why you're here. You found something, didn't you? I wondered how long it would take before some scavenger unearthed Father's little secrets. He always did love hiding things. Letters, ledgers, his guilt. His voice hardened. You shouldn't have come back, Daniel. I came back because of him, Daniel said, his tone steady. He wrote to me. He wanted me to find the truth. And I did. He took a step closer, meeting Malcolm's gaze. He knew you lied. He knew what you did. The evidence is here. Everything you buried, everything you stole. It's over. For the first time, Malcolm's calm faltered. His jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing. You think you can walk back into this world after 30 years and destroy me? You don't understand what you're dealing with. Those papers won't save you. They'll bury you right alongside him. Daniel didn't answer. Instead, he lifted the lantern from the desk and set it between them. The light cast their faces in a warm, trembling glow, the two brothers standing amid the ruins of their family legacy, shadows dancing across the walls that had witnessed their history. You already buried me once, Daniel said quietly, but this time it's your turn to answer for what you've done. Malcolm's gaze drifted toward the fireplace where faint embers still glowed. Then he smiled, and the smile was cruel. You really don't learn, do you? Father thought the same thing, that truth could save him, but in the end, he died here, surrounded by lies and fire. The words struck Daniel like a physical blow. He stared at Malcolm, realization dawning. You killed him. Malcolm didn't deny it. He simply shrugged. I ended his suffering. He was ready to destroy everything we'd built over a few pieces of paper. He'd already called the lawyers. There was no other way. For a moment, the room seemed to tilt. Daniel felt a wave of nausea, of rage so sharp it nearly blinded him. You murdered our father. I preserved the family, Malcolm said evenly. You should be grateful. Without me, the Brooks name would have been a footnote in a bankruptcy report. Before Daniel could speak again, Malcolm reached into his coat and pulled something out. A lighter. He flicked it once, the flame small but steady. I should have done this years ago, he said softly, before you had the chance to come crawling back. He tossed the lighter onto the pile of old papers scattered across the floor. The fire caught instantly, racing up the dry pages, licking across the wood. Within seconds, the study filled with smoke. Daniel lunged forward, but Malcolm shoved him back hard against the wall. Goodbye, brother, Malcolm said, his voice calm as the flames began to climb the curtains. Some ghosts don't deserve to haunt. Daniel gasped, choking on the thickening smoke. The fire spread faster than he imagined, feeding on years of decay. He stumbled toward the satchel, snatched it from the desk, and ran for the door, coughing as heat seared his lungs. Behind him, the fire roared, consuming the room where their father had spent his final days. He heard Malcolm's footsteps retreating down the corridor and followed, half blind from smoke. The hallway blazed with orange light as embers fell from the ceiling. He could barely see, barely think, only move. He reached the front entrance just as a beam crashed down behind him, sealing the passage to the study. For a moment, he thought Malcolm was gone, escaped into the night. But as he stumbled onto the front steps, the wind hit his face, cool and sharp, and there he saw him, standing near the gate, watching the house burn. The fire illuminated Malcolm's face, and for an instant Daniel saw not power or triumph, but something hollow, a man devoured by the very flames he had set. Their eyes met across the courtyard, but neither spoke. Then Malcolm turned and walked into the darkness, disappearing into the trees. Daniel stood there for a long moment, watching the inferno rise behind him. The windows of Brooks Hall glowed like open wounds, and the night filled with the sound of collapsing timber. He wanted to hate his brother, to curse him for everything he had done, but what he felt instead was an unbearable grief. The fire was destroying not only the house but everything it had ever been, its beauty, its history, its secrets. Yet, in the heart of that destruction, Daniel felt something else too. Release. The ghosts that had haunted these walls were finally free. As the first sirens wailed in the distance, he turned and walked down the long road toward the horizon, the satchel clutched tightly in his hand. Behind him, the house that had been both his curse and his salvation burned against the night sky like a dying star, and the truth he carried glowed hotter still within him, unyielding, indestructible, ready at last to rise from the ashes. The ruins of Brooks Hall smoldered for 3 days before the last embers died out. The fire had spread quickly through the old timbers, consuming everything it touched, leaving behind only the skeletal remains of the once grand estate. The marble pillars had cracked from the heat, the roof had collapsed inward, and the great staircase that had carried generations of the Brooks family now stood like a charred spine amid the ashes. When Daniel returned to the site on the 4th morning, the air still carried the faint metallic scent of smoke and rain-soaked soot. The land felt hollowed, emptied of its arrogance at last. He stood in silence for a long while, the satchel still slung across his shoulder, its contents miraculously unharmed. The documents, the journal, the letters, all of it had survived because he had carried them through the flames. It was as if the truth itself had refused to burn. Around him, birds picked through the ash, their small movements the only signs of life in a place once full of noise and laughter. The estate that had ruled over this corner of the South for more than a century had finally fallen silent, stripped of its grandeur, its deceit, and its pride. The memory of that night still haunted him, the roar of the fire, the sting of smoke, and Malcolm's face illuminated by the inferno. The last glimpse he had caught of his brother had not been of triumph, but of emptiness. Daniel hadn't seen him since. The police had searched the surrounding woods, finding only Malcolm's car abandoned at the edge of the property. No body was ever recovered. Rumors spread quickly through town. Some said he had fled the country, others whispered he had perished in the blaze, consumed by the same flames that had destroyed their family's empire. Daniel didn't know which version of the story to believe, nor did he much care. What mattered was that the truth had finally escaped the shadows. In the days that followed, he found himself drawn into a whirlwind of official inquiries and investigations. Fire marshals questioned him, reporters appeared like vultures at the gates of the property, and the local sheriff, an old man who remembered the scandal from 30 years ago, watched him with a mixture of suspicion and pity. Yet this time, Daniel was not a man running from accusation. He was the one holding the proof. The satchel at his side had become both shield and sword. He took the documents first to a lawyer named Harris, a quiet, serious man with graying hair and a reputation for integrity. Harris had been a young associate in the city during the time of Daniel's disgrace and remembered the case well. When Daniel placed the evidence on his desk, the ledgers, the contracts, the letters written in Malcolm's hand, the lawyer's expression shifted from polite curiosity to shock. "My God," Harris murmured as he read through the pages. "These are real." "They are," Daniel said quietly. and I need them to speak louder than I ever could." Harris spent hours going through the material, cross-referencing accounts, comparing signatures, and verifying bank numbers. When he finally looked up, his face was pale. This isn't just corporate fraud. These are crimes that stretch back decades: embezzlement, bribery, perjury, even obstruction of justice in your own case. If this reaches the courts, it won't just clear your name. It'll tear down everything your brother built. Daniel met his gaze steadily. And that's exactly where it needs to go. The following weeks unfolded like a reckoning. Harris contacted a team of investigators, and together they pieced through the mountain of evidence. Every new revelation confirmed the scale of Malcolm's corruption. The empire that had seemed so untouchable was a castle built on deception. Its foundations rotted long before the fire ever touched its walls. The newspapers began to take interest. Within a month, headlines appeared across the state. The fall of the Brooks dynasty. New evidence reveals decades of fraud and betrayal. The story spread quickly, carried by the same hunger for scandal that had once destroyed Daniel's reputation. But this time, the tide was reversed. Where once the world had pointed at him with contempt, it now looked with curiosity and a growing sense of sympathy. Reporters hounded him for interviews, but Daniel declined them all. He had no interest in being a spectacle. He wanted only for the truth to stand on its own, unembellished and undeniable. The authorities reopened the old investigation into his supposed embezzlement. The records proved his innocence beyond question. Every forged signature, every manipulated ledger traced back to Malcolm and his accomplices. The court's ruling was swift and decisive. Daniel Brooks was exonerated of all charges. The words, when read aloud in the courtroom, felt unreal. He had imagined them for 30 years, rehearsed the moment in his mind through hunger, humiliation, and sleepless nights. Yet, when it came, he felt no surge of triumph, only a quiet release, a door closing on a life that had never truly belonged to him. After the trial, Harris urged him to pursue civil suits against the remnants of his brother's company, to claim damages, to rebuild what was once his. Daniel agreed only to what was necessary. He had no desire for vengeance. Money could not buy back the years he had lost, nor the dignity stripped from him in his youth. But what mattered more than compensation was justice, not only for himself but for his father, whose memory had been twisted by lies. A new trial followed, this time for those who had profited from Malcolm's schemes. Executives, accountants, and old family associates were summoned, questioned, and indicted. Many of them broke under pressure, their statements confirming what Daniel already knew, that Malcolm had manipulated them all, using the Brooks fortune as a weapon to buy loyalty and silence dissent. The court heard of secret accounts in the Caribbean, of properties purchased under false names, of politicians bribed to secure contracts. And then came the testimony about his father. A housekeeper from Brooks Hall, long retired and living quietly in Georgia, came forward with a statement. She had been there the night George Brooks died. Through tears, she described the shouting she had heard from the study, the crash of glass, and the smoke that followed. She had fled in terror, believing it an accident, but now her voice trembled as she spoke. "Mr. Malcolm was there that night. He told me not to call anyone. He said his father had fallen ill, but when I looked into the room the next morning, the floor was scorched near the hearth." The courtroom had fallen silent. Daniel closed his eyes as the words echoed through the hall. His father's death was no longer a rumor whispered among servants. It was murder, confirmed in the light of day. When the verdicts came, they were as inevitable as they were devastating. The court declared the Brooks family's company bankrupt, its assets to be liquidated and distributed among creditors and charities. The family name, once synonymous with wealth, was now a symbol of corruption. Daniel was offered restitution from the remaining estate, millions in assets, enough to rebuild a fortune if he chose, but he refused most of it, keeping only what was necessary to fulfill the last wish his father had written in his hidden journal: to restore what the family had taken from others and to transform the legacy of shame into something worthy of remembrance. He used the funds not to rebuild the mansion, but to found a charity, the Brooks Foundation for Renewal. Its mission was simple: to provide shelter, education, and employment for the homeless, the broken, and the forgotten. The irony was not lost on him. A man who had once been cast into the streets now dedicated his life to those who lived there still. It was not penance nor redemption, it was continuation, a bridge between what had been destroyed and what could be saved. Months passed. The newspapers eventually turned their attention elsewhere. The scandal faded, replaced by newer stories, fresher tragedies, but the foundation grew steadily. The first shelter opened in the nearby town, built from the remains of old warehouses donated by the county. On the day of its opening, Daniel stood before a small crowd, former workers, volunteers, and townspeople who had once known him only as a disgraced heir. The speech he gave was brief. He spoke not of vengeance or justice, but of truth and how it must always find its way to light, no matter how deeply buried. As he finished, the crowd rose in the quiet applause. For the first time in decades, Daniel felt something close to peace. Yet, even in peace, the past lingered. There were nights when he dreamed of the fire, of Malcolm standing in the glow of the burning house, his face both defiant and haunted. Sometimes he wondered if his brother was still alive somewhere, hiding under another name, still trying to rebuild his empire of deceit. Other times he hoped that the flames had taken him, that the fire had done what the courts could not. But whether Malcolm lived or died no longer mattered. The truth had survived him. On the anniversary of the fire, Daniel returned once more to the site of Brooks Hall. The land was quiet now, covered in wild grass and scattered with the remains of stone walls. The scent of smoke was long gone, replaced by the earthy fragrance of rain and new growth. He stood in the center of the ruins, near where the study had once stood, and placed his hand on the ground. Beneath the soil lay the ashes of generations, of pride, of sin, of ambition. Yet in that same ground, something new was taking root. He whispered to the wind, "It's over, Father. The truth is free now." A single ray of sunlight broke through the clouds, striking the ground where he stood. It glimmered faintly on the rusted hinge of the hidden door that had once led to the secret chamber. For a moment, he thought he heard a voice, soft, distant, almost tender. Perhaps it was only the wind through the trees, or perhaps it was the house itself offering its final farewell. Daniel turned away and began the long walk down the hill. The ashes of Brooks Hall lay behind him, but ahead stretched something vast and unclaimed, a horizon waiting to be built upon, not with stone or wealth, but with truth. The judgment was complete, the reckoning done. What remained now was the quiet work of rebuilding, not a legacy of power, but a mercy. And for the first time since he was a boy, Daniel Brooks did not feel like a man without a home. He felt like a man who had finally come back to one. The morning broke over the charred remains of Brooks Hall with a quiet unlike any that had ever touched that hill before. The land, once defined by the weight of stone and history, now stretched open beneath the sky like a scar finally healing. Grass had begun to reclaim the ashes, sprouting in small patches where the fire's heat had loosened the soil. The columns that had survived the blaze stood black and skeletal, their marble fluted and cracked, like bones stripped of flesh but still stubbornly upright. To the townspeople, the ruins were an ending. To Daniel Brooks, they were the beginning of something that had waited far too long to be born. Nearly a year had passed since the trial, since the last echoes of the Brooks family name had been spoken in the courthouse as both curse and elegy. The foundation he had built in the aftermath of that judgment had grown far beyond his first quiet hopes. What had begun as a single shelter in the heart of the city had expanded into a network that stretched across the state. There were now workshops where veterans learned trades, classrooms where children without homes learned to read, kitchens that served meals to those the world had chosen to forget. The Brooks Foundation for Renewal had become not merely a name, but a promise, a reversal of everything his family had once stood for. But Daniel did not see himself as the architect of this renewal. He worked among the people quietly as one of them. Most of those who came through the shelters had no idea who he was. To them, he was simply Daniel, the man who always rose before dawn to sweep the floors, who sat with the newcomers to listen, not to speak, and who never seemed to tire, though his eyes carried a weight that others instinctively respected. It was in this anonymity that he found peace. He had been a man of headlines once, though never for reasons of pride, and he had no wish to return to that kind of attention. He still lived modestly in a small apartment above the foundation's main building. From his window, he could see the slow rhythm of life below. Volunteers unloading boxes, the hum of conversation in the courtyard, the laughter of children running between the gardens. Every sound, every sight was a quiet defiance against the silence that had once ruled his life. Yet, even in these moments of calm, the past sometimes returned, not as torment, but as a whisper of memory. There were nights when he would dream of fire, but not the fire that destroyed. Rather, it was a warm glow, soft and alive, lighting the faces of people gathered together in safety. It was, on such a night, under the pale light of a half-moon, that Daniel made the decision that would complete what his father had begun. He had returned many times to the ruins of Brooks Hall over the months, drawn by a feeling he could not quite name. The land seemed to call to him, not as a place of grief, but as something waiting to be reclaimed. The courts had left the property to him entirely. He could have sold it, or let it return to wilderness. Instead, he decided to rebuild, not the mansion, not the old symbol of power and pride, but something new. A place that would stand as a memorial to truth and to mercy. By spring, the plans were drawn. Architects, builders, and local volunteers came together, not because of the name Brooks, but because of the man who bore it now. What rose from the ashes over the next 2 years was unlike anything that had stood there before. Where marble walls once loomed in cold elegance, now rose open brickwork and glass, allowing the light to flood through every hall. At its heart stood a great atrium filled with trees and benches, where anyone, rich or poor, lost or found, could sit and breathe. The building would serve as the headquarters of the foundation, as well as a home for those who needed shelter. But beyond its function, it was something more. A symbol that redemption was not a dream reserved for saints or fools, but something built day by day, choice by choice, upon the ashes of what had come before. On the day of its completion, Daniel stood at the foot of the hill and looked up at the structure that now stood where his family's house had once cast its long shadow. The sign above the entrance read simply, "The House That Remembered." The phrase had come to him one night as he stood over the foundations of the old hall. The land, he had realized, remembered everything: the kindness and the cruelty, the laughter and the cries. But it had also remembered how to forgive. The opening ceremony drew people from all corners of the state: former workers, neighbors, the children of those who had once been harmed by his family's greed. Reporters came too, though Daniel had requested no speeches, no interviews. The only words spoken that day were his own, delivered not from a podium, but from the steps at the building's entrance, to a crowd standing in the open air. "This house," he began, his voice carrying gently on the wind, "does not stand to replace what was lost. It stands to remember. My family once built walls to keep others out. Today we build doors that never close. What happened here will never be forgotten, but neither will the chance to make something better." The crowd fell silent for a moment before the applause came, soft at first, then swelling until it filled the air. Daniel stepped back, his gaze lifting to the sky. It was a clear afternoon, the kind his mother had once loved. The sun broke through the clouds, striking the glass facade of the new building so that it glimmered like water. For the first time, the land no longer looked haunted. In the months that followed, the house that remembered became the living heart of the foundation's work. Families moved into the small apartments built along its wings, each room filled with light and simple warmth. On the ground floor, a library was established, its shelves lined not with ledgers or contracts, but with books donated by schools and townspeople. Daniel spent many evenings there, reading with the children or sitting in quiet conversation with veterans who had found a second life within those walls. But there was one room in the building that belonged to no one. It lay below the atrium, reached by a narrow staircase that descended into a cool, quiet space. There, Daniel had ordered an exact reconstruction of the secret chamber he had discovered beneath the old mansion. The original bricks and stones had been salvaged and cleaned, placed carefully in the same circular pattern. In the center stood a glass case containing his father's journal, the letters, and a small bronze plaque that read, "For the truth that saves us, even when it burns." Visitors rarely entered that room without falling silent. School children would come and ask who the man in the photographs had been, and Daniel would tell them not of wealth or tragedy, but of a father who had once